Loneliness is one of cinema's quietest truths and one of its loudest echoes. It follows us into dark rooms, into crowded streets, into the spaces between who we are and who we wish we could be. And today, on Mr. Smithy Goes to the Movies, we're diving into the films that understood loneliness not as an absence, but as a force, shaping identities, reshuffling desires, bending entire lives out of orbit. Across decades, countries, and cinematic movements, filmmakers have turned solitude into poetry. By the end of this video, we'll uncover how Scorsese, Coppola, Lynch, Antonioni, Kieslowski, and so many others carved unforgettable portraits of isolation. We'll trace the hidden threads linking Taxi Driver to Buffalo 66, The Elephant Man to The Straight Story, Lost in Translation to the aching minimalism of Antonioni. And we'll end with a reminder that loneliness on screen isn't just something we watch, it's something we recognize. So let's step into the quiet. Few films capture solitary confinement within a crowd quite like Taxi Driver. Travis Bickle drifts through New York as if it were a planet whose atmosphere no longer supports life. What makes Scorsese's portrait unsettling is not just Travis's deterioration, but how recognizable his alienation feels. The way he clings to routines, to rituals, to fantasies of rescue and purification. Travis isn't a monster born in a vacuum. He's a man desperately searching for meaning in a city that keeps swallowing him whole. Loneliness here corrodes, mutates, turning fantasies into mission statements and mission statements into violence. 2 decades later, Buffalo 66 reshaped that same sense of male alienation into something more brittle, more pathetic, more nakedly needy. Vincent Gallo builds Billy Brown out of awkwardness, half-wounded boy, half-ego on stilts. His loneliness is shabby, unglamorous, embarrassing in ways that feel painfully human. Every gesture, every lie, every attempt at control is a plea for connection disguised as bravado. It's Travis Bickle without the mythic weight, just the raw ache that comes before the breakdown. But loneliness doesn't always turn inward with such severity. In Chungking Express, Wong Kar-wai captures the fleeting rhythms of heartbreak and hope, where solitude moves like a pop song stuck on repeat, bright, bittersweet, and ephemeral. His characters aren't crushed by the city. They float through it, buoyed by chance encounters, overheard songs, expired cans of pineapple, and the feeling that one more coincidence could change everything. Isolation becomes rhythm, shot through color, motion blur, and the melancholy of missed connections. Gravity strips survival to its barest impulses. But what makes it remarkable is how Cuarón binds physical isolation to emotional recovery. Ryan Stone isn't just drifting in space, she's drifting inside her own grief, suspended between life and the memory of her daughter. Space becomes a metaphor for the moments when reality collapses and you're left weightless, untethered. Her journey back to Earth is less about gravity and more about re-entering herself. Castaway embraces isolation as metamorphosis. Robert Zemeckis uses time not as plot, but as erosion, of identity, of vanity, of everything except the essential. Chuck Noland loses more than weight. He loses the architecture of modern life, clocks, schedules, voices, expectations. What emerges isn't a heroic survivor, but a man reconfigured, rebuilt through silence. Wilson, the volleyball, becomes cinema's purest symbol of manufactured companionship, proof that the human mind would rather invent connection than accept its absence. And then there's Solaris, Tarkovsky's metaphysical chamber piece, where loneliness becomes self-confrontation. The planet responds to longing with apparitions, forcing characters to face the ghosts they fear, desire, or refuse to grieve. Solaris views solitude as a spiritual test. How much of yourself can you bear? How much of your past can you hold without breaking? The Martian, the most optimistic of the group, reframes loneliness as problem-solving. Ridley Scott makes isolation almost playful, science as affirmation of life. Mark Watney survives because he refuses to let silence define him. His perseverance is a reminder that solitude can be endured when humor and curiosity remain intact. The Elephant Man is one of cinema's most devastating meditations on human dignity, not because of what it shows, but because of what Lynch forces us to confront. John Merrick's isolation is imposed upon him. Society makes him lonely long before he understands the word. Yet Lynch's film is tender, even romantic in its empathy. The loneliness here isn't just physical separation, it's the tragedy of being seen only as a spectacle. When Merrick forms fragile connections, they shine all the brighter, because of the darkness surrounding them. And then we have The Straight Story, a film whose quietude is almost radical in Lynch's career. At first glance, it appears to be a detour, a pastoral slice of Americana with no surrealism, no nightmare logic, no psychological rupture. But that simplicity is exactly the point. Alvin Straight's journey across the Midwest is a pilgrimage through loneliness, regret, and the burdens of aging. Every stop, every conversation becomes a small redemption. Lynch removes his usual distortions not to escape his obsessions, but to reveal their core. That loneliness is often a plea for reconciliation with the past. La Notte is Antonioni's anatomy of emotional drought. Every location, clinical apartments, sterile nightclubs, abandoned industrial zones, reflects the disintegration of a marriage that has become a performance. Loneliness here is not dramatic. It's ambient, accumulating in pauses, in glances that refuse to meet, in conversations that hover over nothing. It's the loneliness of two people who remember loving each other but can no longer access the feeling. In The Passenger, Antonioni radicalizes the theme. What if loneliness becomes a means of escape? Jack Nicholson's character attempts to shed his life like a snake shedding its skin. But the film shows that identity, like loneliness, travels with you. The landscapes he crosses, dusty roads, barren outposts, wide-open spaces, are vast enough to swallow a person whole, but not vast enough to erase his existential fatigue. Sofia Coppola's Lost in Translation takes these Antonioni currents and filters them through a modern cosmopolitan lens. Tokyo becomes her emotional labyrinth, dazzling, alienating, alive. Bob and Charlotte aren't just lonely individuals, they're lonely together, discovering that shared solitude can be gentler than shared joy. Coppola captures the ache of drifting in and out of connection, the beauty of a tenderness too fragile to survive outside a hotel corridor at 2 a.m. Valerio Zurlini remains one of cinema's most overlooked chroniclers of loneliness, a director who approached despair with the sensitivity of a poet and the precision of an archivist of human frailty. In Indian Summer, loneliness isn't expressed through grand gestures, but through the slow unraveling of a man who no longer recognizes his own place in the world. Zurlini renders emotional collapse with a painter's restraint. Bruised autumn colors, quiet rooms where the weight of unspoken thoughts becomes unbearable. Family Diary is perhaps his most piercing exploration of familial estrangement. Two brothers navigate the emotional debris left behind by their upbringing, trapped not by circumstance, but by the distance created through years of silence. Loneliness becomes inherited, almost genetic, something passed down through memory and misunderstanding. And Girl with a Suitcase offers loneliness in its most luminous form. Claudia Cardinale's Aida is drifting, searching, hoping, and finding disappointment at every turn. Her loneliness is not tragic in the classic sense. It's tender, radiant, heartbreaking in its purity. Zurlini understands the fragility of youth and the cruelty of those who exploit it. Zurlini's solitude isn't philosophical like Antonioni's, nor metaphysical like Tarkovsky's. It's intimate, embodied, painfully human. Before we move forward, it's worth widening our focus. Loneliness in cinema isn't just an emotional state, it's often a psychological architecture, and few national cinemas understood this better than Poland, where solitude was shaped by history, spirituality, and moral complexity. Krzysztof Kieslowski's work frequently approached loneliness as an ethical condition, something intertwined with guilt, yearning, and the longing to connect. Nowhere is this clearer than in A Short Film About Love, Decalogue 6, the expanded version of one of his most haunting television episodes. A young voyeur watches a woman he idealizes, believing desire alone can fill the void inside him. But Kieslowski flips the equation. Loneliness distorts love just as easily as unrequited love deepens loneliness. When the woman finally sees the young man, not as an intruder, but as a fragile soul, the emotional shift is overwhelming. Kieslowski understood solitude as something that reshapes the moral universe of each character. And then there is Roman Polanski, who turned solitude into horror long before horror recognized its own psychological depth. Repulsion is perhaps the purest expression of Polanski's interest in internal collapse. Catherine Deneuve's Carol isn't just alone. She is unmoored from reality, abandoned inside an apartment that transforms into a weapon. The walls crack, the hands emerge, and the space itself becomes an extension of her dissociation. Loneliness here is not metaphorical. It is violent, consuming, and terrifyingly intimate. Polanski films the breakdown of the psyche the way others film action scenes, rhythmically, precisely, and with escalating dread. Skolimowski's Deep End captures adolescent loneliness with uncanny accuracy. Everything is too bright, too cold, too humiliating, too intense. Desire and isolation collapse into each other, forming a feverish portrait of longing. Skolimowski makes young love feel like an existential trap, both tender and suffocating. If Kieslowski and Polanski turned loneliness inward, John Cassavetes exploded it outward. His cinema is restless, confrontational, unfiltered. Loneliness expressed through arguments, drunken confessions, silences that stretch like open wounds. In Faces, relationships crumble in real time, with characters clawing at each other for attention, affection, or simply the reassurance that they still matter. A Woman Under the Influence exposes the loneliness of a woman whose emotional intensity doesn't fit the world she lives in. Gina Rowlands turns isolation into volcanic tenderness. Husbands follows three men who run from their responsibilities only to discover that distance magnifies emptiness. But all these films lead to love streams, perhaps Cassavetes' most beautiful and least discussed masterpiece. It's a film where loneliness becomes mythic. A brother and sister searching for love in places where only confusion answers back. The final images, awkward and dreamlike, feel like Cassavetes offering one last fragile hope. That love isn't a solution, but a state of grace we occasionally stumble into. Love Streams is less a film than a confession whispered into the void. Monty Hellman's Cockfighter offers one of the most unusual portraits of loneliness in American cinema. Warren Oates plays Frank Mansfield, a man who has taken a vow of silence after losing everything, a self-imposed exile not from society, but from speech itself. His solitude is not emotional, not cosmic, not romantic. It is behavioral. Hellman frames Mansfield as a figure stranded inside his own masculinity, communicating only through gesture, routine, and stoic determination. His world becomes increasingly narrow, defined by rural backroads, makeshift arenas, and the immutable rules of a subculture where connection is transactional and loyalty is currency. It's loneliness as asceticism, a man stripping his life to a single purpose until purpose is the only companion left. And this stripped-down existence connects to another cinematic tradition, one shaped not by American minimalism, but by European introspection. Ingmar Bergman's Wild Strawberries transforms loneliness into a journey through memory, a quiet odyssey where the past becomes both comfort and accusation. Professor Isak Borg travels to receive an honorary degree, but the real destination is inward, through dreams, ghosts, and half-forgotten encounters that reveal a lifetime of emotional caution. His solitude isn't dramatic or violent. It is polite, dignified, almost invisible, the kind of loneliness that accumulates slowly, like dust on a bookshelf. But Bergman exposes its weight with devastating tenderness, missed connections, unspoken resentments, the persistent ache of opportunities never taken. Wild Strawberries reminds us that loneliness can be gentle and still unbearable. Not a storm, but a winter. Bergman's solitude is introspection, but other filmmakers explore it through desire, obsession, or the chaotic struggle to love. And finally, Solitude takes a gentler, more philosophical turn in the hands of Erich Rohmer. His films are built on conversations, wandering, hesitant, searching, where characters try to articulate what they feel long before they understand what they want. While My Night at Maud's, Claire's Knee, and Pauline at the Beach each explore desire through moral hesitation, it is the green ray, le rayon vert, that captures loneliness with the softest yet sharpest touch. Delphine, played with translucent vulnerability by Marie Riviere, moves through the film like someone whose emotional skin has grown too thin. She searches for connection but recoils from anything inauthentic. Rohmer observes her without judgment, letting her awkwardness become luminous. And then comes the ending, one of the most quietly transcendent moments in cinema. A ray of green light, a brief miracle, a cosmic wink suggesting that loneliness is not a permanent sentence. Rohmer believed that solitude could be a form of moral clarity, a way of waiting for something true. Loneliness, then, is not one shape. It's a spectrum: psychological, moral, spiritual, romantic, existential. And sometimes solitude isn't an affliction. It's a discipline, a code. Which brings us to two men defined not by connection, but by ritual. Le Samurai, Collateral, two ghosts drifting through two cities, decades apart, yet closer than they seem. tied together by a single archetype, the solitary professional. Le Samouraï, Jean-Pierre Melville's minimalist masterpiece, presents loneliness as ritual. Alain Delon's hitman lives by a strict code, one that isolates him from everything human. His apartment is a monk's cell, his life, a vow. Michael Mann's Collateral is its natural successor. Tom Cruise's Vincent is another ghost moving through the city. Precise, detached, strangely philosophical. Mann modernizes Melville, transforming solitude into something metallic, digital, nocturnal. Vincent and Delon's Jeff Costello live in different eras, but share the same existential chill. If loneliness often reveals who we truly are, The Lighthouse shows what happens when it reveals too much. Robert Eggers traps two men on a barren rock, surrounded by fog, storm, and superstition. Their isolation isn't simply physical, it's psychological pressure, mythic dread, and toxic masculinity fermenting in a confined space. In this world, solitude becomes a mirror that distorts, multiplies, and eventually shatters the self. Willem Dafoe and Robert Pattinson don't descend into madness because they're alone. They descend because they're alone together, trapped in a relationship where intimacy is impossible and silence becomes violence. It's the kind of film that takes the loneliness explored by Bergman or Polanski and pushes it toward the elemental, the primal, loneliness as ancient curse. But not all loneliness collapses into madness. Umberto D. observes loneliness with neo-realist clarity. No melodrama, no manipulation, just the quiet agony of an elderly man slipping through the cracks of a society that has no place for him. His companionship with his dog becomes one of cinema's purest antidotes to abandonment. Ikiru asks what happens when loneliness becomes a lifelong habit. Kanji Watanabe's search for purpose isn't just a narrative arc, it's a reclamation of his own humanity. Kurosawa shows that even at the edge of death, connection remains possible. Alcazar Balthazar, by Robert Bresson, expresses loneliness through the life and suffering of a donkey, turning simplicity into transcendence. Jean Dielman transforms domestic routine into a suffocating structure that traps Jean in a cycle of ritual, silence, and invisibility. The loneliness here isn't external. It's internalized, mechanized, weaponized by a world that reduces her to labor. In The Conversation, Harry calls isolation is professional, moral, and psychological. He listens to the world but cannot join it. Every apartment, every empty office, every soundproof room becomes an extension of his emotional exile. Manchester by the Sea explores a different kind of loneliness, the kind born from trauma so deep that connection feels dangerous. Lee Chandler isn't just grieving, he's protecting himself from the unbearable weight of memory. His isolation becomes a refuge and a prison. In Wings of Desire, loneliness becomes metaphysical. The angels observe humanity's private sorrows with tenderness, longing to participate in the very suffering that defines human life. Wim Wenders suggests that connection is not only a desire, but a privilege. Paris, Texas transforms loneliness into a desert mythology. Travis's long walk back to himself is both heartbreaking and redemptive, a reminder that some wounds can be healed only by confronting the past with naked honesty. Her explores digital age solitude with uncanny intimacy. Theodore seeks connection in the only place he can control, an operating system, but discovers that even artificial relationships carry emotional risk. Eternal Sunshine reframes loneliness through the fragility of memory. Erasing pain doesn't erase the desire for connection, it simply repeats the cycle. And The Apartment remains one of cinema's most compassionate portraits of isolation, reminding us that even the smallest acts of kindness can rewrite a life. Loneliness in cinema is not one thing, it's many. It's the neon drift of Chungking Express, the cosmic abyss of Gravity, the internal collapse of The Conversation, the ritual of Jean Dielman, the longing of Lost in Translation, the moral anguish of Kieslowski, the heartbreak of Cassavetes. Each film offers a different lens. Each asks a different question, and together they form a portrait not of isolation, but of our need for each other. If you made it all the way here, I think you'll love the next video. Feeling lost? These movies work better than a doctor's note. A guide to 7 uplifting movies that heal your soul and remind you that the world is still full of beauty. See you there.